everybody. Good evening. I'm just gonna I can set this right here. Okay, for those of you that I have not met yet, my name is Jory Micah Peterson. I know that's a lot of names, but Micah is actually my middle name. So if you follow me online, that's why I go by Jory Micah. I just want to start by saying thank you so much to Pastor Mike and Pastor Marilyn for having my husband and I. They have been such exceptional hosts to us, and we're really, really enjoying staying at their house. And thank you to all of you, too, for being so warm and friendly and inviting to us. All right, and also, if you have not met my husband, Luke, he's right back there wearing the hat. And I'm 100% directionally challenged, so you can all thank Luke for getting me here tonight. I am going, and thank you to everyone that tuned in live. Thank you so much for coming and supporting me that way too. So tonight I'm going to share with you probably the most vulnerable message I've ever shared in my life. And I've been preaching since I was maybe 13, 14 years old. So not all the time. I don't preach all the time, but I have been doing it for a very long time. So this message that I am going to share with you tonight is a message from my heart, and it's a message that something I've struggled with for a very, very long time. I'm going to talk about So, have grace with me if I start getting like shaky or something. So, what I've titled this message is 3 lessons we all must learn in the spiritual wilderness. Now, there are like 5 million lessons we learn in the spiritual wilderness, but I have boiled it down to the 3 lessons that I believe are the most important lessons. And the reason I believe that they're the most important lessons is because I believe that they're the 3 things that actually get you out of the spiritual wilderness and into God's good promises for your life. So if you don't know what I'm talking about by a spiritual wilderness, and sometimes people call it the desert, it's basically a time that's very, very long in your life, or at least it seems very, very long, and it's very, very difficult. So feelings of depression, feelings of anxiety, feelings of loneliness, feelings of confusion, those are all very common feelings when you're in the spiritual wilderness. Another thing is that it often feels like God is nowhere to be found and evil is everywhere around you when you're in the spiritual wilderness. When you're there, you feel more than vulnerable and more than uncomfortable. You are continuously hungry and thirsty, which makes you prone to choose things that are not good for you when they come up. And what I mean by that is spiritually hungry and thirsty, because you are lacking spiritual nutrition when you're in the desert. And so that's why it makes you more vulnerable to the schemes of the enemy when he comes into the desert and tempts you, because you are hungry and thirsty in a way that you probably have never been before. Besides Jesus, people do not volunteer to go into the spiritual wilderness. The spiritual wilderness is something that you're driven into. And it usually happens after a traumatic event or a series of traumatic events. Maybe you lost a career. Maybe you lost your church community. Maybe you have a serious health problem, or you lost a loved one or a marriage, or maybe you committed a really nasty sin against God or against someone, your fellow human. Maybe you did all those things. That is pretty common before you head into the wilderness. So I'm going to be camping out a little bit in Exodus, the first 4 chapters, but you don't have to go there because I'm just going to kind of explain and summarize most of this for us. So Moses was driven into the wilderness after a traumatic sin. So just to remind you about the story of Moses, Moses was a Hebrew, and he was born right when the king of Egypt decided that the Hebrews were growing too large of a people, and he feared that these baby boys that were being born would grow up and they would be powerful and be able to revolt against the king of Egypt. And so the king came up with a very evil plan to kill off every Hebrew baby boy at the time that Moses was born. And so Moses' biological mother had a plan, and she wrapped him up in a blanket, and she got a wicker basket and put tar on the bottom, and she put the baby in the basket, and she had Moses' older sister, Miriam, stand by and watch this basket so she didn't just let it float off into nowhere. And sure enough, this basket landed right where the king's daughter was bathing. And she felt sorry for the baby, and Miriam, Moses' older sister, just happened to be standing right there at the perfect time. And she says, "Would you like me to go get a Hebrew woman to nurse this baby for you?" And she agrees. And so she goes and fetches Moses' biological mother. So at the time, Moses was 3 months old, and his mother got to nurse him for 3 more months till he was 6 months old. And she was pretty much his nanny. So it's Moses probably would have known his mother and his sisters. Did he know they were his mother and sisters? I'm not sure. I know he did eventually. But he definitely probably would have played with his brothers and sisters growing up a little bit, and he would have known his biological mother. So Moses grew up eating the best food and drinking the best wine and wearing the best clothes and sleeping in the best beds and living in the best commodities. He was spoiled and bathed in luxuries, and he was given everything on a silver platter. Moses was as privileged and as spoiled as it gets, and he was most likely lacking discipline and humility. He grew up watching his people enslaved, but something happened one day. Moses saw injustice in a different light. It was almost as if he finally recognized that he was a Hebrew, and he saw his people being abused in a way that he could no longer handle. Now, I believe with all my heart that Moses was born with this heart for justice. So even though he was probably a spoiled little brat, he probably still had this inside of him because he was called to do something really big in his life. And so I think God equipped him in this way. But sometimes our gifts go too far, right? And so Moses sees this slave driver beating one of his Israelite people, and it makes him so angry that when he thinks that no one is looking, he murders this slave driver and he buries him in the sand. And then the next day, Moses is just walking along, being the prince of Egypt, doing his thing, and he sees 2 Hebrew men fighting. And Moses, again, with that heart of justice, like most prophets, he steps in the middle and tries to stop them. And one of the Hebrew guys said, "Who are you to judge me? What are you going to do? Kill me like you did that Israelite or that Egyptian?" And so Moses had been caught. And that was too much shame and too much fear to deal with. So this is what drove Moses into the wilderness. This sin. To where if he would have stayed, the king would probably have murdered him or at least punished him pretty badly. But B, I think it was much bigger than that. I think that it was just an overwhelming shame that he just simply had to get away. And he left everything. He left his family, he left his religion, he left his people, he left his home, he left everything, his entire life and identity he left behind when he went out into the wilderness. You know, I relate to Moses a lot in some ways because I also grew up very privileged in a lot of ways. My parents both had very dysfunctional upbringings. My mom's side of the family, basically, she was like the princess, and she was never, ever, ever disciplined, and she got whatever she wanted whenever she wanted it. And my dad's family was like the extreme opposite, where they only knew the emotion of anger and rage. And so punishment came in the form of angry yelling and things of that nature. And so my dad had a really hard time disciplining my sister and I because he would always lose his cool. And so my mom basically, at one point, just took discipline away from him altogether. But the hard thing was is that my mom was terrible at discipline too. So my sister and I basically grew up very undisciplined. That was my parents are amazing parents, but that was definitely their weakness, was discipline. And so my parents sought to give my sister and I this fantasy childhood. When I was 8 years old, my parents bought a 3-story Victorian mansion that was 100 years old, and they redid the whole thing, and it was so beautiful that it was featured in Victorian Home magazine. And my sister and I both had our own room, and each room was decorated to fit our individuality. And we were very, very pampered with beautiful things. And we wanted for nothing. We wore the best clothes, just like Moses. We ate the best food, and we were bathed in gorgeous things. Each year, my parents would give my sister and I a porcelain doll for Christmas. Every single year. So we both had these massive porcelain doll collections. We were also extremely sheltered. My parents did struggle with discipline, but they also kept us under their wing very, very tightly. And they, I already did that part, sorry. My mom was a business owner. Did I tell you that? My mom was a business owner and my dad was a minister. So we had a lot of eyes on us all the time. And so pretty much our only responsibility was to represent our faith and our family well. And so what I did is I ended up giving my life to Christ when I was 13 years old. And when I was there, I remember I was at a youth convention, and the preacher had an altar call, and I went down that day all by myself as a 13-year-old girl, and I gave my life to Christ that day. And I remember when I was down on my knees, just sobbing for what seemed like an hour, I remember the Spirit clearly speaking to me and saying that you will be a minister. And so I stood up that day, and I knew exactly what I was going to do with the rest of my life. But because I got saved so young, and my parents had tons of people. My dad was a minister, and my mom was a business owner. Because all that was happening, I ended up putting a ton of pressure on myself. When I was in high school, I always had at least 10 girls around me who I was discipling. And as I told you earlier, I started preaching really, really young. And my friends and I started a Bible study at my house, and it grew so large that we had to rent out a fire hall. And at this fire hall, everyone from the captain of the football team to the really weird kid that wears like the long trench coat, like everybody was at this fire hall when I was in high school. And so I was very passionate about Christ. And so I would just talk about Christ all the time. And that's all I cared about was talking about Christ. But because I had this calling on my life that was very evident of leadership and things of that nature, both kids and adults put me on a spiritual pedestal. And I began to beat myself up if my friends would not give their lives to Christ or fall away from Christ, or if I would do anything that was slightly immoral. I would just beat myself up, and I just put so much insane pressure on myself. So it's no surprise that I developed chronic migraines the same year that I gave my life to Christ. I continuously thought that I had to be perfect for Jesus, and so I continuously put pressure on myself, and that caused stress on my body. And so I developed these terrible migraines where I would be left out in the cold. I would be, my parents or my friends and my family, they would be doing something awesome or fun, and I would find myself stuck in a dark room by myself in severe pain. And so I got these migraines really young, and they kind of continued all throughout the rest of my life. And then there were other things involved, of course, like probably hormonal makeup and genetics and all that. But I truly thought that I was responsible for everyone's salvation. And I imagine that Moses, as the prince of Egypt, also felt a pretty heavy responsibility to be perfect. He probably sinned a lot growing up, but never did he sin in such a way as to murder someone. And so I imagine when that happened, the jig was up. Everybody knew that the prince of Egypt was not perfect, far from perfect. And of course, this drove Moses to the wilderness. He was all alone and afraid. He was certainly depressed, anxious, and confused in a way he had never been before. He had failed at life and probably had no desire to even live anymore. But something happened. God met Moses in the wilderness at his most broken time of his life. God sent Moses a family that was not his blood. The patriarch Jethro, who was a father to 7 daughters, a shepherd in the wilderness, and a priest, took Moses in and made him his own, even to the point where Moses married his daughter. Moses simply tried to move on with his life and forget about Egypt. He had children, and he became a shepherd under Jethro's authority. The once prince of a powerful nation now spent his days caring for sheep and submitting to Jethro's way of life. Moses carried a plain wooden staff in his hand, and a lot of theologians think it was the staff that he actually used to kill the Egyptian. But now the staff would be used to tend sheep and climb massive mountains in the wilderness. So the first lesson that Moses had to learn was humility. No longer would Moses live a life of luxury. No longer would people put Moses on a pedestal. No longer would Moses get whatever he wanted whenever he wanted it. Like Moses, I found myself in the spiritual wilderness in 2012 after I graduated from seminary. The main reason that I went to seminary in the first place was because when I graduated in 2006 with my bachelor's degree in ministry, I couldn't find a pastoral job. There was a problem that I was totally shocked by when I graduated. Almost every position would say, "We are looking for God's man for the job." Or it would use male pronouns to describe the perfect candidate. I found that even denominations that ordained women still very much preferred to hire men to be pastors, any kind of pastor. Even children's pastor if they want that job. Normally they don't. So that's why women usually do it. So from 2006 to 2007, I ended up teaching in a small Christian school, actually here in Denver. My whole family was out here for a very short amount of time. But even that position, I remember the principal telling me that they were hoping to hire a man for the job. And the only reason that he accepted me, I think, is because the job only paid $15,000 a year. And I think he got to the point where he realized that most men are not going to take that job. Now, I was extremely thankful for this job, even knowing that I wasn't the preferred candidate. I went above and beyond in this job, and I remember that I planned a spiritual retreat for these kids. I didn't really care if they learned math or science, and in fact, they were actually better at math and science than I was. And I just pretended to know what I was doing, but I normally didn't. So I just focused on planning a spiritual retreat for them. So I planned a spiritual retreat for this whole middle school. And it truly was an amazing, amazing experience for the kids. And I loved it. I loved that year. But I was a minister walking in teacher's shoes. And God had promised me when I was 13 years old that I was going to be a minister, not a teacher. So I decided that I would go to seminary. My thinking was, maybe if I have more education, then someone will look over the fact that I'm a woman and hire me. Or maybe I'll become a professor of theology or something of that nature. I truly thought, I wrote my master's thesis on women leadership in the first 2 centuries of the church. And I truly thought that somebody was going to be super impressed with me. And I truly thought that my master's thesis was just amazing, out of this world. But after I graduated with a master's degree in biblical studies, I still had a major problem. I was still a woman, thus I was not God's man for the job, no matter how educated I was. So I did the only thing I knew to do, and I started applying at small private Christian schools again. I ended up getting a job teaching even younger kids. Children's pastor was the only thing I didn't want to do. And I ended up getting a job teaching 5th grade this time, making $12 an hour. And so for me, I was like, I pretty much felt I had been demoted after I graduated with a master's degree. And that was honestly the beginning of my downfall. My heart became more and more discouraged. And that discouragement soon turned into bitterness and disbelief in God's faithfulness to his promises. Not only did I despise how my career was taking shape, but I also despised how my body and my mind were failing me. I had a struggle that I never shared with anyone because I was ashamed of it and I didn't know how to break the struggle. My chronic migraine condition was worsening and expanding into more diseases because I was totally dependent on prescription painkillers. Right after graduating with my bachelor's degree at 22 years old, I made my way into a doctor's office, and I remember telling her, the only thing that has ever worked for me is Vicodin, even though I had only tried like a couple other medicines. But at that point, I thought that this drug was a miracle drug. And so this doctor sent me home with 120 Vicodin pills for the month with refills. With 12 refills. And so, the truth is that I could not handle, one second. The truth is that I could not handle the pressure that I was putting on myself and that I thought other people were putting on me. So, I was tired of getting left behind. I was tired of getting left in the dark rooms. I was tired of severe pain. I was tired of being sick all the time. And I had tried Vicodin for the first time at my graduation from one of my roommates because, again, I had a major migraine and I was going to miss my graduation. And I had tried this medicine, and I thought, whoa, like this is like magic. And so I felt like 1,000 times better within a half an hour. And I have had these headaches since I was 13 years old, and I was 22 when this happened. So I truly thought that I had found my answer to this problem. Of course, I was pretty naive to the dangers of narcotics then. And I had been prayed over so many times, and I never experienced any healing. Now, looking back, I know that the reason that I didn't experience healing was because I refused to deal with any of the root causes of the problem. God wanted to deal with my perfectionism, which was rooted in pride, not Christ at all. God wanted me to learn to trust Him above myself, but this was too scary for me. I wanted to be in control of my own life. And I found something that appeared to be something that would put me back in control of my body and my mind. I took this medication pretty much every day for a straight year. It allowed me to continue my facade of perfection, and it enabled me to exceed in everything I did. With opiates, I felt in control of my physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual pain for the first time in my life. Truth be told, Vicodin became like a god to me because I trusted it more than I trusted God. It took less than 2 years for this medication to majorly backfire. In grad school, I actually had to drop out for a year because I was so sick and I had a major mental breakdown. By the time I was in graduate school, I had graduated to harder narcotics. I needed stronger narcotics at that point because my tolerance was so high. So doctors placed me on everything from long-acting morphine to Dilaudid to the fentanyl patch, which is 100 times stronger than morphine. I didn't use the pills to party at all. I used them to function. I enjoyed taking a couple pills and sitting down and writing a 10-page paper. That was my idea of fun. So what this medication did is it helped me avoid my worst fear, which was failing. Because this illness had kept me it had me fail sometimes because I would miss out on things, and I would not be able to go to my commitments, and I couldn't make commitments. And so this gave me control back over my life, and I felt like for the first time that I didn't have to worry about failing. But something really crazy happened. I developed a secondary disease that's only affects 4% of migraine sufferers, and it's called either rebound migraine or medication overuse migraine. And it's basically when your brain gets addicted to the pain medication to the point where it will actually start creating more headaches and more pain so that you give it more opiates. So many times I tried and tried and tried to get off this medication, but the only answer was to stop the pain medications. And by that time, my brain was so out of whack that it would take, the doctors would always say that it would take 6 months to a year for my brain to go back to normal. And so I would just have to kind of just suffer for this long. And so I would continually try, and then I would always end up back at the doctor's asking to be put back on this medication because it was just too painful for me. So here I was at 27 years old, and I felt like I was just failing at everything in life. To make matters worse, I was laid off of the 5th grade teaching position because they didn't have enough students to fill the position the following year. This was definitely the straw that broke the camel's back. For 7 long months, I withdrew from everyone. I withdrew from society, and I was so sick and so sad, and I just laid on my bed, or on my couch for 7 months with an ice pack on my head. Luke literally worked full-time, cooked full-time, cleaned full-time, did everything. And I did nothing for 7 months. Actually, Wendy from the Wendy Show, she became my best friend. And the anchors in the Today Show, they were also my best friends in my family because I watched them so often. I refused to look for any jobs anymore. I got so stubborn, and I would not even look for a job. I was so angry. I was angry at the church. I was angry at God. And most of all, I was angry at myself. How could I have allowed my life to become such a disaster? Why did God have me go to Bible school if he knew that I wasn't God's man for the job? How could God have allowed me to get this sick? Why was I even born? My whole life felt like a waste. For the first time in my life, I strongly doubted God's faithfulness and love for me. I gained 40 pounds, which is a lot for a 5'2" person. My feet were hurting. I developed fibromyalgia. I was in pain from head to toe, inside and outside. So one day, my husband comes to me and says, "Jory, I found a children's pastor position online. Do you want to apply?" And I remember saying, I was so desperate. I did not want to be a children's pastor, but I've been laying on this couch for 7 months. And I remember saying, not really, but if you apply for me, I'll go to the interview. And so he did. He did the resume and the cover letter, and he did all of that, sent in the email and everything. And within a month, I became the new children's pastor at a church that was ironically named Reality Church. There I would learn the humble ways of shepherding God's most precious sheep, children. The little lambs taught me more than I could have ever taught them. They taught me not to despise the small things, for it is often the small things that are most precious to God. God showed me that if I would be faithful with the small things, that he would give me bigger things when I was ready. But it was a great struggle for me. For 2 years, I worked this job I did not like. But this children's ministry was dying when I took it on because they hadn't had a children's pastor for over a year. And so as I slowly revived this children's ministry, God slowly revived me. My faith, my body, my mind, everything slowly got better. God was teaching me humility. And to make sure that I really got this lesson, God put me under the leadership of the most patriarchal pastor he could find. I was never asked to preach from the main stage except for one time for 5 minutes. Don't worry, it took 30 minutes. I was continuously looked over to preach while the associate pastor, who I actually love, but he did not have a Bible degree, and I did, and he preached all the time when the pastor was out of town or at leadership summits, and I was never asked to preach except for that 5 minutes in 2 years. Not only that, but I knew that if this pastor had read my master's thesis and realized who I really was is like radical Christian feminist and egalitarian, I knew that he would not approve. And so I hid away who I was for 2 years, which was probably the hardest part. But I really think that God was teaching me that if I could submit to this authority, who I completely disagreed with everything he believed, because his foundation was these patriarchal views, I truly believe God was teaching me if I could submit to someone I totally disagreed with, then I could finally submit to God. One day, when Moses was humbled enough and had found contentment living a simple life, tending to sheep, he saw a burning bush that would radically change the course of his life. Now, this bush was just burning and it was on fire, which wouldn't have been highly uncommon in a desert because it's so hot. But the weird thing is that it was not being consumed. And if that wasn't strange enough, this bush starts talking to Moses. And it was God himself. Moses had heard all about the one true God from his father-in-law, Jethro. But never did he experience God before. And I'm just going to read this out of Exodus 4 through 10. When the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the bush, "Moses, Moses." "Here I am," Moses replied. "Do not come any closer," the Lord warned. "Take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." When Moses heard this, he covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord told him, "I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries of distress because of the harsh slave drivers. Yes, I am aware of their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and lead them out of Egypt into their own fertile and spacious land. It is a land flowing with milk and honey. Look, the cry of the people of Israel has reached me, and I have seen how harshly the Egyptians abuse them. Now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people out of Egypt." So after 2 years of children's ministry, I had a burning bush experience myself. The way that sometimes God speaks to me is through prophetic dreams, ever since I was a child. And one night I had a dream that I was in this old, dingy, disgusting looking house, and it kind of looked like a meth house, basically like from Breaking Bad. And there were just like dirty mattresses all over the house, and it was completely dark. There was no natural lighting in there, and there were no windows and no doors, and it was all boarded up from the inside, just layers and layers of boards. And in there, women, it was just women in the house, and we were all walking around like the Walking Dead. We basically were just zombies. And in the kitchen was the only light, like electric light in the house. And the refrigerator was completely stocked with cheap beer. And so back and forth, like a zombie, just walking back and forth to the kitchen. We would go and walk in the kitchen, open the thing, drink a beer, walk around, go back to the kitchen, drink a beer. And it was just, I know it's funny, but it was actually a really scary, oppressive atmosphere. And all of a sudden, someone came in the door, and it was the oppressor. I didn't see who this was or anything like that, but I knew the oppressor, whoever was keeping us captive in this house, came home. Because every woman in the house screamed at the top of her lungs, and everybody scattered. And of course, I was in the kitchen by the beer, and so I saw this light out of this sunlight in my dream still, one ray of sunlight coming in through one of the boards. And so I run over to this board, and I fall to my knees, and I just start ripping these boards off one by one, just ripping them off until I've ripped a hole out big enough for me to crawl through. And I got on my knees, and I literally crawled through this hole. And when I got outside, there were just acres and acres of land, beautiful, lush green land. And the sun was just shining on my face. And again, still in my dream, I felt something inside say, run. And so I just started running towards the sun. And I ran for miles and miles and miles and miles. And then I finally turned around to see if any of the women had followed. And when I turned around, there were just thousands upon thousands upon thousands of women running behind me. And I did not see thousands of women in that house. So I woke up from that dream, and to me, I just knew right away that God was calling me to start a ministry advocating for women to be free, both literally and spiritually, from oppression and captivity. And I truly, just like God told Moses that he had heard the cries of the Hebrews, I felt like God was telling me that he has heard the cries of women and girls all around the world. I know that God has seen what has happened. I know that God sees the oppressive theology that's happening. I know that God sees the abuse that's happening behind the guise of husband headship and male leadership. I know that God sees that women and girls are enslaved in the sex trade industry, not only overseas, but here in America as well. I know that God sees that little girls are being sold off to grown men to be child brides by their fathers. I know that God sees the horrors of genital mutilation that is happening to tiny little girls. I know that God sees that females are being selectively aborted because sons are preferred over girls. I know that God sees that when girls try to go to school and they get acid thrown in their face just for going to school, or get murdered for daring to choose their own husbands. I know that God sees. And just like Moses, I had a wooden staff in my hand too. And it was this master's thesis that I had finally come to realize this master's thesis is just okay. It's not anything to be extremely impressed by. It's pretty common. But God uses the common thing that we have in our hand. And that's all I had. I had no other reason to claim authority in the area of theology except for this master's thesis that was okay. And so I posted this master's thesis online, and I just prayed that God would use it to begin setting women free. Because I truly believe that until women are set free in first world countries, how are we supposed to go and help these girls that are experiencing these insane injustices if we're not even free here? And so I started praying that God would start to free Christian women, because it would be Christian women mostly that are going to go after these kind of issues. And so my master's thesis has been read thousands and thousands of times, which my husband and I laugh about all the time, because who reads master's thesis? No one. But God transformed this master's thesis into my staff of authority. Just like God used Moses' staff that was just a common wooden staff, he used it to part the sea, he used it to bring water forth from rocks, he used it to perform miracles. It was just this stupid wooden staff, but God used it. In my next sessions, I'm going to tell you 2 more lessons that I've learned, and I'll kind of finish up some of the loose ends that I've left tonight, tomorrow morning. And I just want you to leave you thinking about this. What common thing are you holding in your hand? Again, for Moses, it was this staff. For me, it was this thesis. This question is worth pondering, because it is often the very common thing that you are holding in your hand that God will transform into something uncommon, that will help you through the wilderness experience so you can get to the good promises that God has for your life. Thank you.